Everyone from around the world. This is our final Seoul National University Fall Lecture Series, and we're so privileged to have Professor Felipe Correa joining us from New York. He's not in Seoul. I wish he was in Seoul, but he's joining us from New York. But before we do that, I just wanted to do a little bit of AIA-related housekeeping. For those of you that are joining us from all over the world, I see a lot of names. This is great. If you could make sure that you've registered through the Eventbrite link. The Eventbrite link, you'll see it in the chat window. And then in the chat window, if you can just simply type your name and you'll be registered for credits. So we can get you learning units for your participation today. So thank you again, Felipe. And I'm going to do just a little introduction so we can get started with this lecture. Felipe Correa is a founder and managing partner of the firm Somatic Collaborative, and he's also professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Virginia. Prior to joining UVA, he was professor at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he directed their urban design program. And just to sort of go off script for a little bit, Felipe and I taught alongside each other, particularly in this joint architecture urban design core studio at Harvard. And I think I actually learned more from Felipe than the students, actually, where the architecture professors like myself were basically teaching urban design as just scaling up architecture into urban mega buildings. Felipe taught us that architecture and urban design are actually separate, but they're closely intertwined disciplines with their own specific strengths and logic, and that, of course, work in coordination with each other. So, I mean, this is just a story just to tell you that Felipe has that rare talent of being able to work at that important seam between architecture and urban design. Felipe is also co-director of the South American Project, a research network that endorses the role of design within the rapidly transforming South American context. He's authored many super interesting books. They're beautiful to look at as well. But some of them include A Line in the Andes, which won first prize at the Pan American Architecture Biennale. His most recent book is called Sao Paulo, A Graphic Biography. And I think it makes this really powerful statement that we can only intervene in a city through a deep understanding of its history. And I actually had the privilege of featuring Felipe's research on Sao Paulo in a recent Seoul City exhibition that I curated called City as Verb. So thank you again, Felipe, for joining us. And I welcome you to start sharing your work with us today.
Well, thank you very much, John, and everybody at Seoul National University and AIA for hosting me today. And thank you, John, for that kind introduction. Of course, very fun memories when we were teaching together, and of course, where we forged a long-lasting friendship. That's, I think, the greatest outcome of being colleagues are the friendships that sort of remain for life. And of course, you're one of those close friends. Very happy to be here today. Seoul is a city that's very close to my heart. I sort of was a finalist for a competition in Seoul at a very early age in my career in the early 2000s. So I visited Seoul many times, and it's a city that it has always fascinated me. It's captivated me, but has also made me feel very at home. And those are the cities that I like the most. So let me share my screen so that I can start the presentation with slides. There we go. Everybody can see this? Yeah, okay. So today I would like to sort of briefly present one specific project, a project that John mentioned, which is Sao Paulo, a graphic biography. And I'll go into detail into this applied research project, but before I go into it, I want to maybe define in more general terms sort of the body of work that we've developed over this past 10 to 12 years through Somatic Collaborative, and the mindset with which we actually sort of shape particular projects. So before I go into the specifics of the project, I first want to describe a series of frameworks that I think have been important for our practice. And I think for me, the first one has to do with the disciplinary silos that we inherited from the post-war era, and a specific approach to the discipline of architecture and urbanism today. And if in the post-war era, we inherited a series of siloed professions, right? The architect as the author of buildings, the landscape architect as the author of open spaces, the urban planner as the manager of public works, and the engineer as the builder of infrastructure. This sort of segregation of disciplines created a completely disjointed city, a heavily monofunctional city where infrastructure was primarily just sort of utilitarian, where buildings had very limited relationship to other systems in the city, where landscape was generally seen as autonomous from buildings. And I think this image from the Futurama it exemplifies this condition. I think we always need to remember that the solutions of yesterday, the visions of yesterday, are the problems of tomorrow. And in many ways, every so often, we need to re-envision a particular mindset, a particular approach as to how we engage the built environment. So if we inherited this sort of siloed disciplinary framework, I think today we are beginning to see a much more interesting set of overlaps among these disciplines. This, by the way, doesn't mean that the architect is necessarily doing the work of the landscape architect, or that the engineer is doing the work of the planner, right? It's not about merging the disciplines into one muddy condition. It is actually about finding moments of overlap so that we can actually establish dialogues that allow us to engage projects of greater scale and complexity. And I see the practice of urban design as a bridge that ties these disciplines. I actually don't see necessarily urban design as a separate discipline per se, but I do see it as a practice that can tie these different disciplines together, that requires a particular language and knowledge across these disciplines. Within the work that we actually do in the office, for me, there's a very important overlap between landscape architecture and architecture. I think landscape architecture offers an incredible connection to the life sciences, while architecture offers a very precise connection to the material sciences. And I think that the overlap, the dialogue between sort of the life sciences and the material sciences are extremely important for us. This is sort of a series of images from the vision plan we developed for the transformation of the UR campus in downtown Monterrey. Of course, we are also interested in specific sort of architectural scales, and most specifically in one particular aspect that I think architecture is quite instrumental which is negotiating relationships between interiority and exteriority. And how do we as architects at multiple scales negotiate these conditions are also of interest for us. This is the proposal for the perched house, which was a house sort of a part of 24 different sort of proposals done for the outskirts of Kassel as part of the Ways of Life competition a few years ago. The other framework that for us is extremely important is a scalar framework. As architects, I think it's more important to be an amateur across scales than to be an expert in one specific scale. And I think it is sort of how we actually think, analyze and project at certain scales, and then develop design solutions at the precise scale for the questions that we're asking is an important sort of a skill that architects need to have, and something that's very important for us in the office. And I always like to show these two projects, the smallest project we've ever done, which is a table, right? We're very interested in sort of the way that things come together, the way that materials actually come together, and perhaps the larger commission we've ever had, which is the Arizona report, which is a visualization study of water management practices in the state of Arizona along the Phoenix-Tucson mega region. Within that context, about 50% of our projects are conventional architectural commissions, design commissions, competitions, etc. The other 50% is applied research projects, projects that actually where sort of funding from different sources allow us to think on a particular topic for a longer period of time. And across those two scales that I was talking before, between the architectural fragment or a piece of furniture and the territory, there's a body of work that addresses a multiplicity of scales in between. And of course, in this context, scale is not only important, but also audience, geography, and who the client is. And I think the dialogue between client, larger audiences, sometimes the person that hires you is not the people that you're working for. This is particularly important in projects of larger scale. How do different contexts, all the way from sort of Latin America, Europe, Asia, influence our work, and the dialogue that begins to happen among these sort of different constituencies and stakeholders is also extremely important in the way that our work is informed. And finally, I would actually say that sort of for us, another important component of architecture is that sort of the practice of architecture is iterative. There's not one way of approaching architecture. There's not one avenue. But for us, it is about exploring through different mediums and through different sort of avenues of knowledge. And in that regard, of course, for me, design pedagogy and the way we think, sort of how we teach students through the studio model is extremely important. Applied research, projects that take 1, 2, 3, 4 years to develop, asking sort of larger questions that generally all projects in a conventional office would not be able to be developed in this format, given the structure of billable hours. And then, of course, professional practice, which in many ways requires more precise answers in a much more limited amount of time. And I think the dialogue between these three avenues for me is what actually produces a larger sort of body of work, and the way that one particular avenue enriches the other is also of extreme importance. As I always say, we all learn from someone. So I do like to sort of put always up front certain figures and certain people that I think for me are extremely important. Somebody that whose work I admire enormously is Manuel de Sola Morales, and specifically the way that he argues for drawing as a way of sort of describing and simultaneously designing spaces. For Manuel, sort of analyzing, right, drawing and projecting is simultaneous but not synonymous. And that for me is extremely important, that these two things happen at the same time, but an analytical framework and disciplinary know-how come together in a project. They're not the same thing. I think sort of other sort of literature that for me has always been very important is the work of François Choy, and specifically The Rule and the Model. And in many ways, sort of the way that architecture in many ways inscribes particular habits in society and how these have actually changed over time. And finally, two other figures that sort of at a particular moment in time were at extreme odds, right? Aldo Rossi and Gianfranco Caniggia. And the larger sort of historical dialogue between typology and morphology. The idea that sort of the city can be actually reduced to to a deep structure through type, versus Caniggia's, which was Rossi's argument, versus Caniggia's argument that relies more on the importance of the forma urbis, the morphology of the city, as the driver of urban form. And I actually make the argument through my work that today, given sort of the digital technologies and the data that we have to analyze cities, we can actually establish a much more fluid dialogue between typology and morphology, that these two don't necessarily have to be at odds as they were at a particular moment in time. And this is something, for example, we develop in our work in as part of the vision plan for the Metro de Quito, where we analyze the Spanish American block and its subdivision from an institutional block, right, a monastic block, 100 meters by 100 meters, the right scale to accommodate a monastery, and its gradual subdivision into a collection of patios in 16 parcels that actually turn an institutional block into a domestic block, sort of once again establishing an interesting dialogue, I think, for me, between sort of a deep structure and absolute type and the gradual sort of morphology that that sort of the city adopts over time through this fragmentation. So with that framework, I would like to sort of go more specifically into Sao Paulo graphic biography and explain a little bit what this project is about. And the first thing that I'll say is that of all the cities in the world, the city of Sao Paulo has the largest amount of post-industrial land in the world, inner city post-industrial land. It sort of throughout the 20th century became the capital of manufacturing for Latin America. And of course, in the last 10 to 20 years, has sort of finally migrated primarily into a service economy, leaving behind a huge tract of post-industrial land adjacent to the center along the Tietê River. And then Haddad Foundation called us to develop a project that could actually propose a vision for this post-industrial land. And the tricky thing about the term post-industrial is that it's always describing a condition of what it used to be, but never what it is or what it should become, right? So for us, the role was to actually imagine what this post-industrial site could actually be in the larger context of the city. And for this was approximately a 2-year project where we assembled a dedicated team of people that were both sort of experts on the ground in Sao Paulo and a larger team that was operating here in the United States. And for me, it was very important to bring a team not only that brought many different disciplines, architecture, landscape architecture, urban planning, curatorial studies, historians, but that also brought many different cultural perspectives into the project. And I always like to read sort of not the names are here for you to see, but the nationalities of the people that collaborated. So US, Mexico, France, Hong Kong, Greece, South Korea, US, Hong Kong, mainland China, US, Uruguay, Brazil, US, Mexico, but lives in Brazil, and Brazil. And I think for me, this is important because it actually allows us to see the city from a very different perspective. I think that the perspective of the foreigner, in many ways, allows sort of to cut through the everyday transparency of the city in a way that people that are used to the habitual ways of the city do not. And for us, the mix of the team was extremely important. Here's the city of Sao Paulo. This is the Pinheiros River. This is the Tietê River. And the Arco Tietê, the center is right here, is this huge area here along the Tietê. And this is the area that we were actually tasked with generating a vision. An area that throughout the 20th century, primarily through very harsh sort of engineering operations, reduced the river from a flowing floodplain into a canalized figure, all to the service of sort of an emerging industry. So for us, the mandate of the project was to rethink this area in relation to what we defined as 4 key elements: hydrology and the relationship of water in these lowlands, the transformation of the block structure, the transformation and rescaling of mobility infrastructure, and then the redefinition of the site to accommodate inner city affordable housing. But if in fact these were sort of the key terms to drive the project forward, set up with the Haddad Foundation, For us, the question that Sao Paulo opened was a much more expansive one. In what the team sort of asked in relation to this project was, well, how did a city that in the 1840s had 20,000 inhabitants grow to be a metropolitan region with close to 30 million inhabitants today, depending how you think, right? In the course of a century. And for us, that history was extremely important to answer sort of the questions of the project at hand, but also to provide a bibliography about this to the city of Sao Paulo. If you actually look at the bibliography of the city of Sao Paulo, there are thousands and thousands of books written on Sao Paulo. There's not one that specifically addresses the history of its urban form. And as architects, for me, it is actually essential that we look at social, cultural, economic issues, but always, I think, in many ways, from the perspective of the form of the city. That has always been a crucial part of my work, and that became a crucial mandate of this project. And this image on the left, which is actually not part of this project. It was part of a previous project that I did called Beyond the City, Resource Extraction Urbanism in South America, was very telling for us. It actually shows the transformation of the entire southern Paraná River into a hydroelectric Eden, modeled after the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. And this project around sort of built, sort of it started in the 1940s and sort of all the way through the 50s and 60s, even until today, it actually continues to expand, is the element that actually guaranteed a steady source of energy to the city of Sao Paulo in order to establish confidence in industrialists to invest in manufacturing in the city. So it was actually the transformation of the hinterland what fueled the growth of the city. And we're seeing this at a huge scale. There's Sao Paulo, its connection to the interior, the port, and then Rio de Janeiro is right over here. That's the Atlantic Ocean. So for us, this relationship between sort of the way that sort of that drawing began to define Sao Paulo as a nodal point between a port that connects the city with world markets, a series of rail and mobility infrastructures that connect the hinterland, and this middle point between resource extraction and global markets became a point of departure to begin to analyze the city. So on the one hand, we were very interested in the parts and pieces that make up this forma urbis. We were also interested in the larger history of architectural and urban projects that have shaped the city in relationship to these challenges. For me, it is very important when looking at cities that we not only focus on the problems, on the challenges, but also on the lessons that the city offers. And for us, this dialogue also became a critical component of the research. This is a diagram that was created very early on in the process, along with the graphic designer, Neil Donnelly, who's a New York-based graphic designer who has done most, if not all of our projects, our website, all of our books, all of our reports. And we work with him very, very closely because the structure of the book becomes the structure of the research. And in this context, we decided to organize the research in 5 chapters, a larger sort of unit, which is the graphic biography, which is the history of the urban form, a series of chapters that are more about current precedents, references, and best practices in the transformation of post-industrial districts, in projects that sort of use mobility infrastructure to reorganize new districts and cities, and then a last chapter, which is the evolutionary plan for the Tietê River, the proposal of the project. And in a way, the structure of the book also became the structure through which we actually thought the project in a graphic language in which each of the chapters continue to add sort of the table of sort of the chapter dividers add sort of the forthcoming chapter as a way to show that the book sort of begins to build from one chapter to the next. And I'll show very briefly snippets of these specific chapters. The first one being Sao Paulo models of urban growth. And I think for us, the challenge here was to begin to synthesize the processes of this major metropolitan region through drawings that can abstract it in a manner that is synthetic and comprehensible. And you have to realize that we're talking about a city, not only that is the sort of, that it has close to 30 million inhabitants in its sort of broader metropolitan region, but that it is also the third economy in Latin America. If the metropolitan region of Sao Paulo would be a country, it would be the third economy in Latin America. Brazil, Mexico, and then Sao Paulo. So it also shows sort of the economic impact this footprint actually has in the state and the region. So we began by looking at the city through 8 different categories. The city of ridges and valleys, which began to look at hydrology, city of citadels, grid and fabric, city of points, vertical growth, city of spreads and densities that looks at mobility, city of voids that begins to look at different models of open space, city of collective living that begins to look at sort of housing and the way that housing has constructed a metropolitan identity, the city of warehouses and industry, and the city of layered economies. And these became, in a way, a series of lenses to begin to calibrate the different urban forms that actually make up the city. We always open each of the chapters with a historical aerial view that in many ways show the early days of this transformation. This is the confluence of the Tietê and Pinheiros River. And from there, begin to narrate the larger history of that particular line, in this case, sort of looking at hydrology and how a city, right, in a terrain that was a free-flowing plain, gradually over time reduced that plain into a canalized figure to be able to accommodate space primarily for the use of industry. This, of course, is further aggravated by the fact that the water brings, so that the city takes its potable water from reservoirs that are on the southeast, about 80 kilometers from the ocean, but actually drains its served waters into the Paraná and then out to the Atlantic through Buenos Aires. So in many ways, the drainage of water of the metropolitan region is sort of highly complex in that it actually drains in reverse, inland and then out. So this chapter actually begins to visualize, and here I'm just showing a few images, the many different layers that make up the hydrological structure of the city. And then we always close with a series of photographs taken by Leonardo Finotti, one of the sort of most established Brazilian photographers that actually agreed. We commissioned a series of photographs where he agreed to recreate the historical images that we were incorporating in the book, to always be able to sort of open and close with a sort of an image that actually explains the larger cartographic material. And then, of course, begin to extrapolate certain relationships. For example, the relationship between topography and socioeconomic income, right? Who begins to occupy what grounds, and sort of what are the larger neighborhoods that are associated to the historical industrial sort of districts in relationship to more well-to-do neighborhoods that often begin to happen sort of much higher in elevation and so on. The city of grids and grains also began to look at sort of the urban form through a similar perspective, opening with this photograph of Jardim America. This is the first garden city ever built in America, which was actually built in 1912, 1915 in Sao Paulo, designed by Parker and Unwin. In fact, Unwin traveled to Sao Paulo for 3 or 4 months to sort of oversee the construction of the city. And of course, this begins to unravel a fascinating story, which is that the city of Sao Paulo does not actually have a regularized plan. In that way, it actually is very similar to Seoul, that it actually is the collection of very sort of dispersed different sort of fragments that make up the larger urban mesh. So on the one hand, you end up with a city that's highly kaleidoscopic, right? You can find any form of city within Sao Paulo. Certain fragments look like Milan, others look like Mumbai, others look like New York City. But when you begin to look at that at a larger scale, you actually end up understanding why it has such complex problems in terms of traffic, right? Most of its traffic relies on these spines, many of them which run along the river, but it actually does not have a very effective distributive network, which is what grids actually provide in cities. And in fact, one of the major recommendations at large that we've made to the city has to do with sort of expanding the capacity of the grid at an intermediate scale. How do you actually extend connectivity in a much more gridded or mesh-like system, rather than relying entirely on spines that very easily collapse with the increases in traffic. And of course, here you see Leonardo Finotti's photo of Jardim America, and sort of this incredible phenomenon that the city has, which is these extremely low density lungs right in the middle of the city, which also happen to be primarily single family residential neighborhoods, but that actually begin to create sort of this reprise of towers in a city that's primarily composed by sort of vertical points. Another aspect that for us was extremely important had to do with the drastic shift in scale between mobility infrastructure that's primarily conceived as an element that connects sort of the hinterland to the port, and other scales, primarily the scale of the urban block in the city, and also beginning to look at ways in which sort of the city has in a very inventive manner negotiated those conflicts in infrastructure, primarily through urban and architectural projects. Perhaps one of my most favorite ones, and I showed this image before, is the Centro Cultural Sao Paulo, where a residual space between what they call an avenue, but it's actually a freeway, a street, and the right of way of one of the metro lines, right? This was an extremely residual space that was left behind these two mobility infrastructures, and basically the subway is going underneath, and how this was transformed into a new public facility that created an outdoor garden for the space around it, and perhaps one of the most fascinating and democratic public spaces in the city. This is a space, for some reason the image is a little bit blurry, but this is a public space where sort of kids can go and rent video equipment to make movies. They take dancing classes. You can rent a room for a particular course that you want to teach. And in many ways, it's a project that was able to take an extremely residual space in the city and give it value through architecture. And that, I think, for me, is perhaps one of the best sort of synergies between architecture and urbanism that one can find. I'll go through some of these other categories a little bit quicker, but this is Avenida Paulista, one of the main sort of business avenues in the city. And this particular chapter looks at issues of verticalization, the larger history of the city in terms of how growing vertically, and primarily the typology of the tower, brought a new form of metropolitan identity to Sao Paulo, right? Being modern, being contemporary throughout the sort of primarily the post-war eras, actually also meant living in a very different environment. Living in sort of in a vertical apartment, the emergence of sort of new office towers, and how sort of density through points actually became an element that defined the city. And of course, this is Paulista Avenue today, and it's quite amazing to see one of the most iconic, the transformation of one of the most iconic and important avenues in the city, from a city of villas to a city of towers, primarily in the course of 80 to 90 years. And for people that know Sao Paulo, there's Lina Bobardi's Maspi museum. And of course, then also beginning to build arguments about how this, how the verticalization of Sao Paulo as a mechanism can actually be improved. And for us, while I don't necessarily oppose to sort of the development of towers, I think there has to be better regulation of, one, how the towers meet the ground, but two, how bonuses in density can actually be given in exchange for creating and improving the quality of open space on the ground. And I think sort of how you actually establish mechanisms that improve the city through the construction of these towers is what Sao Paulo needs to look at in the future, because of course this is a trend that for a variety of reasons is not going to stop as the city continues to densify. One of the other chapters also begins to look at issues of public space, the different scales and models of public space that actually exist in the city, who has access to them, what is the relationship between socioeconomic income and access to public space. And of course, within this, we highlight what I actually think is one of the most fascinating public-private partnerships, which is the notion of the SESC. The SESCs, there are approximately about 200 throughout the city, the state actually. And these are social and recreational clubs that are actually paid by a 1 per 1,000 tax on every commercial transaction. If you're buying a Diet Coke, you're paying a 1 per 1,000 tax that goes to the SESC Foundation. And then the SESC develops these clubs that everybody that is part of some kind of commercial enterprise has access to. And if you don't, there are certain other ways in which you can actually get access to as well. So it's a very, very inclusive sort of system. The most famous one is, of course, Lina Bobardi's SES Pompeia and the transformation of an old factory into this club with sort of the iconic vertical gym here at the back. But there are many, many others. And of course, the newest one is this one done by Paulo Mendes da Rocha, which is actually the transformation of an old department store. And of course, the building is a quite banal building from the 70s, 80s that was completely gutted. And of course, this incredible section that has a pool, a public garden, spaces for dance, sports, dental offices, exhibition offices, a library, a restaurant, administration, and a theater, all sort of introduced into the department store to be able to create quite an exceptional public amenity and actually prove to the city that you can actually have public spaces in elevated floors. When you actually have the density that you have in a city like Sao Paulo, you can elevate the public to levels that go way beyond the street. And of course, this is one of the less iconic ones, but this is a photo that I took from a helicopter on a Sunday that actually begins to show the, and of course, this is pre-COVID, but the use of these spaces in a highly dense urban city. So that was sort of the first chapter that actually began to look at sort of the history of the city. Some of the other chapters began to look at best practices across the world, where investment in mobility infrastructure could actually reorganize larger districts. And of course, we began to draw and visualize some of my favorite examples, key among them Grand Central Terminal, right? Where the construction of the terminal is not the project itself, or is not the project by itself, but the terminal was actually conceived also in relationship to a larger urban project that decked approximately 12 blocks over the rail yards of the terminal to be able to create what we know today as a sort of Central Park North, or the northern part of the terminal, establishing an important dialogue between investment in infrastructure and the creation of new urban ground. Something that projects like Porta Suiza in Turin also begin to do in the way that the new sort of train station covers the tracks, but also establishes more effective links between two sides of the city that were sort of extremely divided because of the scale of the tracks. So from sort of, and just here I'm just giving you snippets of these chapters. The next sort of there was another chapter that sort of looked at issues of collective living, which I won't describe here in detail. Sort of the larger history of sort of architectural experiments in collective living within the region. And then we went back to look at historically what have been the urban visions that have shaped Sao Paulo. And of course, for me, there are actually two that in relationship to the river are extremely important. The first one is the 1923 proposal by Saturnino de Brito, which actually argued against the canalization of the river. I think it was very visionary at the moment, and actually proposed a series of reservoirs that would actually allow you to, in a much more passive way, control the flow of water, but not completely canalize the rivers, and for sure not build mobility infrastructure along the edges of the river. And the other, of course, proposal that for me is fascinating is the proposal by Le Corbusier, which in a very Corbusian manner, sort of you have the two axes, one that connects the hinterland with the port, one that connects Sao Paulo with Rio, and then of course the development of the city along sort of those highways, and then the downtown in the center. But what for me is extremely important about the proposal by Le Corbusier is not actually the buildings nor the highways, but the landscape. The fact that in Le Corbusier's plan, he also allows the rivers to flow freely. His argument was that the infrastructure should not sort of overlap the rivers. And of course, the city did exactly the opposite of what these two plans proposed. So I've given you a snippet of what's a much more sort of comprehensive volume, but with sort of that preliminary research, we actually move forward to develop a proposal for the Arco Tiete that revolves around these three elements: mobility, hydrology, and the development of a new block, of an urban project at the scale of the block. And I'm not going to go into full detail in the proposal, but I'm going to explain it through a series of images that I think sort of highlight the process quite well. This is the city of Sao Paulo in 1842, right? This is the city in 1942, and here we begin to see already the canalization of the river. And this is the city today, where of course the river, the Tiete River, is placed in a straitjacket, and of course becomes the cause of major hydrological and environmental issues in the city, because as the city has grown, it actually cannot accommodate the capacity of stormwater in a city that, because of issues of climate change, is getting more and more rain on a yearly basis. So it is from this drawing specifically that our proposal departs. And here's where we propose a series of operations for the transformation of the river, and the first of the area. And the first one has to do with the rescaling of rail infrastructure along the edges. This is a rail that for many, many years has served the industry. Today is pretty much derelict. I think it has 2 trains a day. And we're actually proposing that it becomes a major sort of mass transit artery, that it reduces its footprint, because the amount of rail that you need today is very different than the one that you actually needed in the 1940s. And that it actually develops a system of local and express trains that can bring people from the periphery to the center much faster than any other system can in the city today. The great invention of the local and express metro, which is sort of a New York invention, is that somebody that lives, for example, in the Upper West Side and somebody that lives in the Bronx can actually arrive to work at the same time, because the 2 trains are actually working at the same speed. It serves as a way to equalize geography. And I think here, our proposal sort of is that this line can be reutilized in that manner. Also, by reducing the footprint of the rail, you can actually then begin to establish better connections from the consolidated city into the post-industrial area, and begin to reorganize the grid so that blocks that were originally dimensioned for industrial use can actually accommodate residential use. And the rescaling of the block then becomes a critical component. And then, of course, the third aspect of the proposal that we put forward, which is perhaps the most controversial, is for the city to set up a transfer of development rights where the city buys back or exercises eminent domain to buy all land adjacent in the city and exchange those rights with parcels in developable areas in zones that are closer to the city center and slightly farther away to the river. And the point of this argument is that the city needs to give the river, the space back to the river. Sao Paulo as a city, and sort of it's a quote that's attributed to the great architect, the great sort of a Brazilian architect Paulo Mendes da Rocha, is that Sao Paulo has always had a very pornographic relationship with its river. That historically it's always been put to the use of something. And that today the time is right to establish a more romantic relationship to the river. And I think that that is extremely precise. That if you actually ask any Paulista if the city has a river, they'll say, yes, we have two rivers, but they're basically two dirty canals. And those canals were put in place for with a particular mindset towards putting the landscape to work in relationship to industry. And the argument that we're making is that maybe today the performance of that river has to be much more cultural. It has to be much more environmental, and that giving this space back to the river is the only solution. Because if you do not do this, there's no way that the hydrological infrastructure in the city can be updated to deal with the impacts of environmental change. And then, of course, once that is set up, establish certain hotspots of development, primarily on public land, where you can aggregate significant amounts of parcels to then sort of start heating the market for the gradual transformation of the district. So this sort of was the entire project was put together as an official report, but also as a book. One thing that for me is always very important about these projects is that they need to become not just a report for the client, but a public book, a public document in the form of a book for a larger audience, and that they always have to be published in the language of the geography where we're working. So we teamed up with University of Texas Press, which were fantastic, along with Romano Guerra Editores in Sao Paulo, to produce this bilingual volume. And as part of the volume, we actually asked experts in different fields, some from Sao Paulo, some from abroad, to write a series of essays that contribute to the larger narrative. So in this case, Marcia Castro, who's the chair of the Department of Public Health at Harvard, who's Brazilian, who's from Sao Paulo, wrote this amazing sort of piece about how the relationship between investment in public space and health, specifically in relation to mosquito-based illnesses. So sort of the relationship between sort of health and investment in public space. People like Alexandre de la Jayakov, which is one of the most important sort of urbanists in Sao Paulo, wrote about sort of what he calls the art of the collective construction of space, which has to do a lot with sort of the scale of the pedestrian in a city like Sao Paulo, and so on. And of course, the city was sort of the project was presented in Sao Paulo through a major public symposium and also an exhibition, in addition to many public presentations that are ongoing with the municipality. This was the exhibit at the Escola da Cidade that opened in August, which actually brought an incredible number of people to come see the work, have a conversation about the work, and people across the board. And actually, one of the most interesting visitors was Fernando Haddad, who's the former presidential candidate, who unfortunately lost against Bolsonaro. I wish he would have won and not come to the opening, but that didn't happen. Who was also the former mayor of Sao Paulo. And I think for me, these kind of visits become extremely important because you actually put the project in the minds of people that can actually make important decisions. Of course, the other extremely important constituency for me, students. A lot of sort of the work that we do is to sort of inform a larger audience about these projects, but one of our key audiences are students and how we teach, not only how we learn from cities, but how we teach our students to think about cities, to think about the way that you actually draw cities is critical to our work. And of course, the way that the project then gets presented in other forms of media. This is an article in one of the main pages of Folha, which is the main newspaper in Sao Paulo. And for me, the fact that the plan was actually placed, of all the images from the project, they selected the plan was very telling, right? Does it mean that they're gonna build this plan as it is tomorrow? No. Most likely we would be sort of tearing down a lot of people's houses. But it actually means that we can actually open a conversation about a very bold project that is absolutely necessary for the city. So on the one hand, for me, it is very important that this becomes part of the larger imaginary of the city. It also is important that it becomes part of dialogues with other cities. This was a presentation that we did on the project in Mumbai, where we had a great conversation with a dear friend and colleague, Raul Merotra, about the parallels between urbanization and water in cities like Sao Paulo and cities like Mumbai. And of course, this was published in Live Mint in Mumbai. Not delighted about that photo, but what can we do? That's the photographer they sent. And of course, also the way that the work is presented also in context within the discipline. Of course, this is the Sao Paulo project, the way it was presented in Seoul, in the city of Seoul last September as part of the Seoul Architecture Biennial. And of course, this is Iggy, Ik-sun So, one of the key team members of the project that actually was in Seoul with us last September. And of course, to finish the lecture, I generally finish the lecture with a sort of a future project. But today, I'm going to finish the lecture with a drawing, part of a competition we did many years ago for the Magog waterfront in Seoul. But a drawing of a river in a city that actually has been very important for me in the way that I see cities and the way that I see cities in relationship to rivers. And that, of course, is Seoul and the Han River, another city that, of course, has a much more important river than Sao Paulo, with an incredible history of engineering, and that perhaps today is also at a moment where the relationship of the city to its river could also be sort of reinterpreted and rethought through the lens of architecture and urbanism. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that very compelling lecture, actually. And I'm glad you finished with that image of Seoul, because that was one of the discussions about your project when it was presented here, is that there are so many parallels. Of course, it is specifically about Sao Paulo, but there's so much that we can garner from that, especially in terms of the water, the canalization of waterways, things like this. So we have shifted into the Q&A, the discussion part of our lecture this morning. And for those that are online on YouTube Live, we're going to have, I think, a time to take a couple questions, at least two or three. So if you can type those questions in, and I'll try to get to you. But first and foremost, I wanted to introduce another guest we have from semi-afar. Thank you so much, David Salomon, for joining us. Just a quick introduction. He's associate professor of art history at Ithaca College. where he's also the coordinator of the architectural studies program. And actually first met David while we were teaching together at his previous post at the University of Pennsylvania, and he has taught at a lot of global universities before that. His scholarship focuses on the relationship between everyday environments and aesthetics. And he's been widely published and exhibited. And most recently, he is co-curating a traveling exhibition called Ambiguous Territory, Architecture, Landscape, and the Post-Natural. He will also be co-editor of the forthcoming book of that exhibit, which will be published by ACTAR. So let's please welcome David to our conversation today. And since you're coming in from afar and it's late over there, could I throw the mic over to you, hand the mic over to you, and have you ask the first question?
Yeah, please. Well, thank you, John. Thanks for having me. Felipe, good to see you, and thank you for that really compelling and inspiring talk and for the work. There's so many ways I could imagine diving into it, but what I found myself writing down and really wanting to know more about, I guess, is the graphic. And I looked up graphic while we were talking. This is what you can do when you're on Zoom, which is the first definition that comes up is about drawing. And the second one is about making things vivid and explicit. And I think that this issue of making things vivid and explicit is really present in so much of the book. And it made me want to ask about drawing techniques. So the other thing I was writing down was photos, maps, diagrams, axons, and plans. And it does seem like I was never taught as an architect how to draw a map. I barely was taught how to draw a diagram. I was taught how to draw axons and plans and sections. And I guess what I want to ask about is how, like you talked at the beginning about the fields, right, being stratified, being brought, and then how do you bring them back together again? And I'm curious, like how you and your team draws is a similarly kind of attempt at synthesizing different disciplinary techniques. Or I guess I want to ask, like, how do you know when to draw a diagram and how do you know when to draw a map?
Right. No, I think it's actually a great question. And I think before I answer specifically when and what, which I think is a great question. Well, first, great to see you. We're both on the East Coast, but we always seem to run into each other in faraway places. So last time we saw each other in Santiago, so it's very appropriate that we're seeing each other today virtually in Seoul. So look, I think we live in a moment where when we were being educated, finding information was critical. Right? Actually, access to information was one of the most difficult things in sort of building a graphic bibliography of a particular geography. I think today we live in a society where sort of the digital and data revolution provide an overabundance of data, an overabundance of information. And a critical role of sort of the work that we do is actually finding methods and techniques that allow us to edit that data, to make educated choices, to be able to translate what's purely digital data into knowledge through architectural forms of representation. So that's, I think, sort of the larger sort of general mindset to the project. From there, I think it's very important for us to find what are the techniques from the different disciplines that best answer the questions that we're asking. And some of them come from landscape architecture, right? And sort of ideas of the cartographic and layering, the cartographic light box, the way that you sort of unravel things through layering. Others actually come more from the discipline of architecture and the way that you can, in many ways, scale up the idea of the technical drawing, right? A question that we generally ask with the team is, how do we build a technical drawing at the scale of the city? How does that sort of begin to to work. So at the end, yes, I think the drawings are about being able to, in a very graphic manner, communicate quite easily a series of in a more sort of synthetic manner, a series of processes that are generally invisible to the naked eye. And how then do you communicate sort of through these drawings certain ideas to people that sort of can make important decisions in these cities, but that actually maybe don't see them, one, because they don't have the training, or just because when you actually live in a city for your entire life, you stop seeing things that are obvious to people that come and visit, right? And I think these are the things that inform the process through which we draw. But I think also critical to this is the makeup of the team. And sort of the disciplinary training and the ability to translate. I think not just it's not just about what software we use, but also what becomes the right software to answer the question at hand.
John, do you want more questions, or do you?
No. I think we could just keep on going around and building the conversation, and I'm going to come back to you. But in that line, could you tell us about your title a little bit, building a culture of description? Because I think it's related to David's question. Yeah, what is a culture of description?
I think for me, as architects, how we actually describe things, right? How do we actually begin to explain certain parts and pieces, certain components of the built environment is integrally related to the way that we then begin to intervene upon them, right? There's no such thing as a neutral map. There's no such thing as a neutral drawing. So people always sort of say, oh, Felipe, you always make these drawings, you always explain these processes. They're so rational, but they're not political. You never speak about the political. And I actually always tell them that they're not reading the drawings properly, right? That actually in the choice of drawings that we're making, we're being extremely political. We're being extremely selective in sort of the scales that we want to represent, in the things that we want to abstract versus the ones that we actually want to foreshadow. So in that way, for us, building this description becomes critical to then developing a particular design strategy. And here I go back to the idea of Manuel de Sola Morales, which is extremely important, which is that description and design need to happen simultaneously, but they cannot be synonymous. They're not the same thing, but they need to occur in dialogue. And that for us is extremely important in our projects. That is, I think, the way that you actually are able to imbricate design in sort of a larger and more complex historical process, and therefore give the form content.
Yes, I think that's a great way to phrase it. The draw, and it's interesting that you use the word description now that I hear you say that. But at the same time, you're saying there's no innocent drawing. Every drawing has an intention, and maybe every drawing has an ideology. And so I'm wondering, should we actually expose that ideological content so that it can become part of the discussion? You know, instead of trying to take a drawing and convince someone, why don't we actually expose its intention? But also you use description rather than narrative. You know, a lot of architects are now talking about, oh yes, the narrative is so important. The drawing has a narrative quality. But what for you is that difference between narrative and description? If the drawing is not innocent, how come it's not a narrative?
But I think for me, description relies entirely on, not entirely, but significantly on ideas of observation. Right? While a narrative in many ways does not necessarily rely purely on the observation of a particular thing.
That's right. It can be projective too, maybe, you know, and imaginative in that way. Yes.
Well, so can descriptions. But
Yes. I know what you're saying. I was trying to, in a way, clarify for our students who may be liberated by this, but also sort of pursue a set of drawings that might actually be maybe too, knowing the difference, I guess, between narrative and description, I think would be important for them. So thank you for that. Professor Hangman Zhou, could you join us for a little bit? Oops, I think your mic is muted. It's too high tech. Yes.
Yes. So thank you for your lecture. It's very interesting, and I have one question. Maybe it's not in line with the conversation before, but I saw your the researches and the visions about the Sao Paulo, but it's kind of based on some sort of traditional values that we have developed for the city so far, like connections, and then the environmental, healthy environment, and then well distributed of goods and products, and so on and etc. But I'm very wondering of your kind of opinion about these current drastic changes about the view of the cities. Let's say these days the city originally, I think, places where the people and objects are accumulated, and then get together and live together and use together. But recent the COVID-19 crisis, and then fourth industrial revolutions, which is focused on the digitals, maybe demand us quite the opposites. We don't need to no longer get together, or we have to stay away. So that thinking about all those the recent requirements, do you have any opinion about the kind of urban developments or urban planning to put those requirements into the your visions about the cities?
You mean in terms of requirement, in terms of COVID and social distancing?
Yeah, social distancing and all those things.
And I guess what Professor Zhou, I think you're also asking about, well, in the terms of the fourth industrial revolution, that work is distributed everywhere now.
Yes,
there's no central
yes.
factory areas. People are connecting online anyway. And public space, what is public space, I guess?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's well, I think it's they're two slightly separate topics, but both equally important. And I think that in many ways, sort of what ties, I think, all humans across the globe is that we're social beings. We actually, I think, need interaction with other people to survive. So while I think that sort of, for example, certain things like harsh zoning in terms of where we work, where we live, where we sort of manufacture are gradually being dissolved, I think today the importance of public space and publicness in cities is essential, especially because ideas of publicness are drastically disappearing within sort of the realm of the city. I also think that sort of certain trends, specifically in the way that we actually work, and the decentralization of work, could actually be very beneficial, because one of the major issues that cities have, and Sao Paulo has this as well, is that most sources of labor are in the center. Most people live in the periphery, right? They can only afford housing in the periphery, and therefore commutes into the city center in Sao Paulo, for example, it's an hour and a half each way And that's if daycare is in the same direction as your job. If not, it becomes sort of 2.5 hours. And this, of course, becomes one of the greatest losses of GDP for cities and countries. So what actually a more decentralized framework for work allows us to do is to create much more polynucleated cities, to actually create new centralities where living and working can be in much close proximity. But that is not going to happen automatically, right? Because you're still going to need a certain amount of infrastructure for work. This idea that office space is going to disappear because we all work from home during COVID is brutally naive, right? And that leads me to the second point, which is sort of regulations and new frameworks in relationship to the COVID pandemic. I think it's very important for all of us to remember that cities have existed for millennia and have survived many, many pandemics, many epidemics, right? So I think moments like this are important for us to reflect on how we actually make cities more resilient, how we actually make cities more just, not in relation specifically to COVID and social distancing requirements, but in relation to how cities can respond to crisis over time. And just to give you an example, this issue of publicness then becomes extremely important. Here in New York, the moment that COVID hit, most privately owned public spaces were closed, right? So the idea that you can actually create parks that are private became very problematic, because guess what? Only the parks that were actually administered by the municipality and are inherently public is where you could take your kids. And if you live in an apartment that's 40 square meters with 2 kids, you need a park. It's not a question of, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity, right? So I think, just to give you another example, most of the essential workers in hospitals in Manhattan cannot afford to live in Manhattan, right?
Right.
So we need to look at that, not in terms of how we resolve it for the immediate pandemic, but more about how do we actually resolve it in sort of larger societal goals that might make cities more resilient and more just for a variety of reasons. So I think for me, the general advice when it comes to COVID is that I think we need to think more long-term and more holistically than sort of the immediacy of than what the immediacy of the pandemic sometimes forces us to think.
Yeah, yes, I'm totally agree. But the reason I raised this question to you is that I have a that kind of problem that when I design some sort of district in Seoul or kind of newly developed area, but I saw one of your vision diagram that you kind of making series of new connections overcome the railroad, right? But these days, after COVID situation and post industrial revolution, those connections, those kind of grid type of mesh type of the road framework is for the goods and products for the the what is it, the deliveries, but the people wants to these days are you have pedestrian sidewalks and personal mobility, the cycle road and the vehicular road are put together. Actually they running on same route, right? But the other lecture that the Masood, the one of the partner of BIG, showed us one their projects, the Toyota Woburn City, which has the new kind of road framework where the vehicular circulation and the pedestrian circulation and personal mobility circulation, they are all different system, but the kind of woven together. So maybe that could be the answer after the this COVID situation, or that could not be the answer. But the kind of, I feel a little bit kind of paradoxical, pressure of getting an answer from the, the urban designers that to solve this situation, but we have to take a one, solution that we connect all, the roadway as a kind of traditional manner that we developed so far, or is there any kind of new things that we have to think about for that,
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that's essential that we need to think about is that this idea that the street is actually used to move people and goods, primarily in sort of motorized vehicles, is a very new thing. Streets have existed way longer than vehicles, right?
Yes.
And the primary purpose of a street is to be a space of publicness. How it's actually configured will change over time. It'll adapt to different technologies. It'll adapt to different sort of cultural habits. But I think what for me becomes essential in the way that we actually conceptualize streets is that their publicness and their space of appearance has to be maintained. And that's for me what's so, for example, worrisome about autonomous vehicles when people actually ask me, well, how do we think of streets should be designed for autonomous vehicles? I don't think streets should be designed for autonomous vehicles. I think we need to understand what kind of streets we want as a society, and then have a conversation as to what is the role, for example, that autonomous vehicles have in these streets. How do they sort of participate with sort of non-motorized vehicles? What is the space of the pedestrian? And I think that that's where when the section of the street begins to be interesting. But I think what's also important to take into consideration is that in 20 or 40 years, that section is going to be obsolete. And it is actually the way that the larger morphologies that create that space, how those are designed, is what's going to remain. And its configuration will change over time. So for me, it's more about the street as a space of publicness that can take many different forms, rather than as an exercise in road engineering. If I don't know if that helps your answer.
Yeah, it's very. I'm very happy to have the kind of. I feel the same way that to you, but I can't find any new kind of new quick solution for this, but.
Actually, Professor Zhou is working
Yes.
on a lot of regional scale things. He's designing actually our new satellite campus, the whole thing. It's an incredible. He's being very modest right now, but it's an incredible urban organism. But I can tell you're going through some dilemmas how to deal with circulation, because once I wasn't so convinced about the example from BIG. I thought it was very clever, but I think it really sort of it corners itself into this kind of neoliberalist version of the city, where pedestrian is solely aligned with commercial. You have the nice cafes and you're walking along, and then you have the workers, with this delivery infrastructure, and separating all those different kinds of circulation. I fear that it will reinforce a neoliberalist version of the city that's driven solely on commerce. That's my just gut reaction from seeing those images. David, what do you think? You can change the subject too.
You're muted. Yeah. David, you're muted.
I'm trying to be quiet. Well, I had wanted to ask or talk about the romanticizing river, or I guess, and there was two infrastructures I wanted to ask about. I guess I'll ask about that one. The other one was the infrastructure of research, which is the slowness that you described and how you set up 4 years of research, and what's the infrastructure for that. But maybe that can stay on the back burner. But let's say, like I've written about aesthetic infrastructure, which is, it's more than a park. It's, it's I guess inspired by the Parkway programs in the United States in the 20s, which was to say that there was no distinction made between the function of the highway and the experience of the highway. That the experience as a kind of visceral event, I should say, was very important. And it seems to me that, so I was very, very encouraged by that, the thinking of the river, right, which had become infrastructures operationally. And so this idea of thinking of the river in a different way, in an experiential way. But I guess I wonder, given this conversation, it makes me seem like, does the street need the same kind of attitude, which is it can't just be seen as this provider, it has to be seen experientially.
Of course.
And then it gets to the question of sensibility, I think, at least. Like, so romantic, I'm intrigued by that, and it makes me wonder, what does that look like? And so I guess, which is then gets me to, yeah, what does that river that you're talking about look like, or what would these streets start to look like? And obviously can't answer that by talking, but I guess where does that figure into, like, it doesn't seem like a graphic analysis issue, or is it? Is that, can that come out of that, the designing out the
that's part of the, I didn't show those, when I was showing the proposal, I showed it at a much larger diagrammatic scale. But I think the point that you're making is an extremely important, which is that infrastructure cannot be devoid from its civic dimension, right? That there's a way that infrastructure performs in society as a civic space, and that has a certain bravura, right? That actually gives it an emotional place in society, right? And that in many ways is the difference between Grand Central Terminal and Penn Station. And I think here, a part of our sort of call in the project is that, yes, the river has to be reinvented as a much larger hydrological sponge, but that it cannot purely be that. It also therefore has to become a new space in the city that is recognized as a commons by the larger citizenry of Sao Paulo. Right, and I think the same thing actually applies to the design of streets. How do we actually, and that for me is the most important component, how do we reconfigure streets in a manner that are seen as part of the larger civic dimension of the city, and not just as a utilitarian element to move things from point A to point B. And I think the point that John was making in relationship to retail and sort of the neoliberal city model is extremely important, because actually, if there's one thing that's disappearing from cities at an unprecedented speed, is retail. You're not going to be able to, for example, 20% of ground floor retail in Manhattan right now is vacant. And this is not a COVID thing. This was pre-COVID. Right now, it has skyrocketed even more with COVID. So I think, for example, a very important question for us in the next decade of the 21st century is, what are ground floor level streetscapes going to look like when you don't have the economy to support a sort of a commerce on the ground floor? I mean, there's a limit to the number of banks and T-Mobiles that you can actually have on a street front, right? So I think this goes back to your point, David, that that has to be part of a civic and, quite frankly, an aesthetic project. I think the worst thing that we can do is actually devoid urbanism from sort of the larger notion of it being an object of design and an integral part of an aesthetic project.
Yes, that's great. I love the fact that you use the word bravura. That our infrastructure has to have this emotional impact. Actually, Professor Zhou has a meeting with our dean, so he's heading out and saying goodbye. Thanks for joining us.
Good to meet you, and very, very happy to be able to dialogue with you.
Yes, I'm sure you guys will have a lot to talk about with drinks when you come to Seoul, or vice versa.
Fantastic.
We have a question from one of our students, Unsub Sa.
Okay, can I start?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, First of all, thanks again for this really again compelling lecture, and I also like that the idea that these works are also a part of pedagogical
Mhm.
thing to the students in one hand. And my question is that so can a description or narrative and what's learned by them can be become something like a prototype for another city or um, some does it can be a sort of prototype for that can teach the other cities or um, so to be more clear, I want to ask this question because I was curious about what should be done for the newly emerging cities or newly developed cities. Some cities are becoming more dense as the time goes by, and this is can be a case in many of the Asian countries, which they had many undeveloped cities. They are being developed and densified. So should they learn from the other cities or make a completely new description, or on the other hand, learn from even older history of themselves? So yeah, this is what I
I mean,
wanted to
I
ask.
think I think there are many components to your question. I think it's a great question. I think there are many components to it. One, well, I don't think the specific strategies are replicable. The model of how you actually approach cities is what becomes a sort of replicable in other cities. And this is, for example, why UT Press as a publisher was actually interested in doing the book, right? Not because they're going to sell sort of thousands of copies because it is Sao Paulo. They're interested in the way that sort of the book can sell in terms of its methodology as a blueprint to analyze cities. So I think that that's an important distinction that we need to make. I think the other point that that is important that you're making is that design by definition is derivative, right? So new cities, old cities, how they're as it doesn't matter if they're extremely well designed, if they're extremely banal, they're always being designed based on a particular reference, right? Based on a particular set of cultural habits. So they're derivative in a particular way. And I think specifically in the context of Asia and specifically mainland China, I actually think it's a fascinating experiment that we will have to evaluate in maybe 50 or 100 years. And I think that there are many cities, for example, in mainland China that are being built from scratch today, right? Or in the last 10 or 15 years. Some will be extremely banal. Others will be the model of urbanization in 50 or 60 years. And I think you need to look at each of them one by one and actually try to understand what are the larger logics, what are the larger parameters that are shaping that urbanization. And you're going to find sort of some that are not great, others that are incredibly inventful. In actually some that are highly criticized today will be praised tomorrow. We can't forget that sort of when Chicago was in its major sort of boom, it was criticized as basically the worst form of uncontrolled capitalism that we've ever seen. But now we all love Chicago.
Well, why was it first criticized like that? Just out of curiosity.
Because both Chicago and New York in the 30s and 40s, they were criticized as sort of uncontrolled growth, as uncontrolled capitalism, as of course shifts in scales. And cities always sort of raise controversies. So the speed and growth, right, brought forward by sort of certain industries, by certain investments in mobility infrastructure, I think makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And I think a lot of that is what we're seeing in China. And I think you need to look at them with a gimlet eye and assess one by one. And not just China, I think other parts of the world, Vietnam, Indonesia.
Right. Well, the big takeaway that I is this word that you've used before, and what I learned from you when we were teaching at the GSD, the students, is that all cities are derivative. You know, that it's something that I think some architects are afraid to admit. You know, this quest for originality sort of erases the fact that yes, cities are actually built on morphologies and typologies and histories. And so I think that the strength of what you're bringing to the table is that, of course, you're an architect, but you're also an urban designer, but you're also a historian and an urban theorist. And so as long as we begin to admit that cities are derivative, I think that puts us at a much better place to start from. So I really appreciate that you saying that so directly. That being said, also about cities learning from each other, and so thank you for that question. I think that was very good. Your exhibit here in Seoul was looked at quite a lot, actually. It was very inspiring, and the reason why it was inspiring maybe is not so clear. The reason why it is because, as you know, Seoul was first urbanized recently, you know, after the 1950s and the 60s and mostly in the 70s for different reasons that it's being urbanized today. And it has similarities to Sao Paulo in that there were modes and ideologies of efficiency, you know, and economy and production that was driving it. So every road that was built was built along that umbrella of not about livability or things like this, but more about let's get these goods moving, let's connect to the periphery, all those kinds of things. So there's a little bit of similarity, I think, to Sao Paulo. And then the thing that especially some of the people in the urban planning offices were looking at your drawings, they're looking for clues to how to fix a compromised city. Because now when we look at Seoul, we have these overpasses, we have these not only canalized waterways, but under street waterways, and they're constantly looking at ways to fix something that is essentially now being built for different reasons, now being renovated for different breeding and for different constituencies, and also is essentially broken. You know, it was a kind of urbanism that's not working, and so this is more of a comment, I guess, than a question. But I think what some of the projects that we showed, like that residual project, you know, that became a cultural center, it's built on land that no one else probably would have used. Those are the kind of conditions that we have to look for in our cities. Yeah. But yeah, could you continue a little bit along that?
You know, I think that's a great point. And I think, of course, one thing that we all need to confront today is that the idea, well, we're seeing certain parts of the world that are building cities from scratch. The vast task of our role as architects and as urbanists is that of upgrading existing conditions, of revamping existing conditions.
That's right.
And therefore, how are we able to understand the systems at play, right, to then be able to transform them, become critical. And I think in this sense, the role of the architect, the role of the urbanist, the role of engineers in many ways, in sort of a much larger sort of cohort of stakeholders that participate in this process, is that of sort of developing processes that are about transformation rather than pure invention. And that becomes very difficult in cities where it generally is more expedient and, once again, more efficient to rebuild the same system new when it fails rather than to rethink it. And that, for example, is, for me, one of the biggest issues and problems with something like the Big Dig in Boston, right? Where sort of a highway that was above ground was simply sunken and expanded in capacity, while maybe the more sort of long-term mindset should have been, well, do we really need all of this traffic to continue to go through the center of Boston, or could it actually be rerouted so that we don't have to invest in this brutal amount of, in this brutally expensive public works projects to sink something that shouldn't be there to begin with, right? Mm-hmm. So, in that way, what's the name of the park that the highway that they?
Cheonggyecheon. Cheonggyecheon. Yes.
Is a fantastic example where the city said, well, you know what? There's going to be more traffic. Period. People will have to take mass transit. That I think is a very radical way of, in many ways, altering the standards that are put in place in cities.
That's right, and that was the other lesson that you brought to us today. We all know Grand Central, and it's an incredible building, but then you showed it with the lid of the ground lifted up, and it's actually just a head house for a much larger system. And it's an icon for a much larger system. And so in that way, one of the things that people do not realize about the Cheonggyecheon is that the urban, much credit to the urban design offices here, the urban planning office, is that they made the bus routes much more efficient. They were so confusing in Seoul, but they labeled them, they upgraded them, they turned them all into low emission gas. And so it took, that was a 2-year project, totally revamping the bus system so that they could do the Cheonggyecheon. So the kind of intermixing of these things. And I know you've done that kind of research. You did projects in Mexico City and things like this, where first you take care of the transportation and then you can really get in with the urban design.
But I think you need to think it simultaneously.
That's right. That's right.
Yes. And I think that goes back, I think, to David's point of the way that you actually build a larger urban project in the backbone of a mobility infrastructure project.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. Well, we are almost out of time. I'm sorry, I had so many comments and questions. I kind of commandeered this a little bit too much. But David, do you have any sort of last comment or last question?
I guess I want to, yes, which is that there's something synthetic about drawing, and it doesn't matter if it's by hand or by mouse or whatever, but there's something that captures so many things simultaneously that I think that's to me one of the power, and it doesn't have to be poetic. It doesn't have to be a Hayduk drawing.
Right.
And so I think this issue of the techniques that we still have as a discipline are so important to trying to capture bus routes and trees and ice cream and capacities. Like that actually can still be captured in a drawing, so I really appreciate this analytical and projective simultaneous, like that the drawing, which they need some captions. I understand that, but there's something about that syntheticness, if that's a word, that is somehow to me really encapsulates what a lot of the things that we've been talking about here tonight, and I really appreciate. Like, it's not something I've really thought about that way, and so I really appreciate the opportunity to have thought with you today, and thank you, Felipe, and John for Felipe for inspiring it, and John for having me tag along. It was really great.
Yes, that's an incredible. That you've very clearly outlined why Felipe's drawings are that important. And Felipe, you had mentioned that you borrow from the landscape architecture discipline, but you also borrow from the architectural scale, technical drawing, and expand it to the urban scale. And so I've never seen drawings like that before that you've done. Usually, you like you mentioned, you divide between map and diagram and urban plan, but you actually synthesize across those, and I think they have that information not only to describe, but also have some political agency, like showing like you met the presidential candidate, showing people this is the possibility. So I think that it's an incredible reference for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. No, I think that sort of this, I think going back to David's point, and also along what you're saying, John, is that sort of, yes, they bring a level of synthesis, but they also bring a level of abstraction, which means that you can sort of project multiple interpretations upon them. And of course, that is the essence of the architectural plan, right? Of the orthographic projection. It's specific, but also abstract. So, well, thank you. It's been a great session, a great Q&A as well. And also, of course, fantastic to see old friends that we always see in faraway places.
Yes. Thank you so much for joining us, Felipe. And this is hopefully this is the beginning rather than an end of something. Let's continue to discuss it, collaborate. We'll find new ways to involve you.
Yeah. You know, I have a soft spot for Seoul, so anytime I'll be there.
It's going to be great when you come back and visit us.
Absolutely. Okay.
And great, thank you, and thank you everyone online for joining us. And we'll see you all next semester for another lecture series. Thank you again, Felipe.
Thank you so much to everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.